Jimmy Carter's funeral was the center of attention. First ladies of former and current presidents, international leaders, and all those involved in. Although Washington was present, one individual was noticeably absent, and it caused everyone to posing the identical query, where was Barack Obama? And Michelle Obama sat by themselves, appearing solemn as he paid homage to the 39th president, but his spouse is nowhere to be seen to be located while everyone else is alive. The First Lady was standing next to their spouses. A mystery was generated by Michelle's vacant seat. That generated headlines and excitement on social media, anchors frantically seeking clarification. Was it to ignore a family emergency or anything more important? The official answer was disgraceful. Looked almost too easy or convenient, due to the fact that when discussing one of the most adored First Lady in American history, the funeral for there's always more to the century-long narrative. But before we disclose what actually prevented Michelle Obama from being involved in this momentous farewell, that you must comprehend Jimmy Carter's true identity. Because of this was the end, and it wasn't just any funeral of a time, the last farewell to a man who changed the definition of what it is to be the President of the United States. The majority of presidents are either wealthy or political families. However, Jimmy Carter originated in peanut fields and dirt roads. As you can see, a baby is born in 1924. His father owns a peanut farm in Plains, Georgia. His mother works at a general shop and farm, a nurse who violates all societal norms by treating black patients in the same way regard as white people. That infant would develop into the most unlikely. Jimmy was the first president of the United States. Carter's early years seem to have been from another century. There was no indoor plumbing and electricity while there were other potential presidents present. Jimmy was piling up on prestigious prep schools, putting peanuts on wagons and making sales door to door. He saved enough money by the age of 13. Funds to purchase 5 homes in the neighborhood. Yes, you heard correctly, a 13-year-old estate tycoon. But this is what actually Jimmy Carter was formed by observing his mother violate Georgia's racist standards of the 1920s. Black guests would be invited by Miss Lillian via the front door rather than the rear. Instead, she would welcome them in the living room. Little actions that are necessary in the kitchen. Amazing bravery in a segregated South. Jimmy, who was young, learned these things. Discovered that acting morally frequently implies being by yourself after high school. Carter did something that was shocking. He entered the US with everyone aboard planes. Not bad for a tiny town. The Naval Academy farm boy, he received his diploma in 1946 and married Rosalind, his sister's best friend. Smith would later have one of the longest presidential marriages, 77 years of history, but we'll get to that amazing tale of love later on. His naval career seemed bright. He was chosen for the nuclear submarine program operating under the renowned a man like Admiral Hyman Rickover. He had seasoned sailors cry with his demands, but Carter was advancing in the Navy at the time. A latter disaster occurred at home. Earl, his father, was dying of cancer. Jimmy's family peanut farm was dying. Had to decide whether to continue his military profession or preserve the family business. Rosalind loved Navy, even if she didn't want to. Life, he quit and went back to flying. 1953 was the year. At the age of 29, Jimmy Carter recently made a choice that would alter American history. Back in Georgia, plunged into farming using the ferocity he displayed in the Navy, but the Supreme Court had changed. The South just rendered a decision in Brown v. Board of Education announcing segregation in schools unconstitutional, and a young peanut in Plains, Georgia. The farmer was keeping an eye on everything with the keen eyes of a person who comprehended that a shift was imminent. Carter turned into engaged in his neighborhood, serving on the school board, hospital administration, library board, but it was insufficient. Had greater aspirations and campaigned for office in 1962. The state Senate of Georgia, and prevailed in spite of his opponent's enormous vote fraud. Carter demonstrated the deception in court and sat down. 4 years later, he ran for governor and lost. The majority of politicians would have forfeited. Jimmy Carter instead traveled for the following 4 years, shaking hands in every part of Georgia, hearing about people's issues, developing relationships. He ran in 1970 for governor and prevailed, just like Governor Carter did. Something noteworthy, he said. Racial discrimination's appropriate moment is during his inaugural speech. Keep in mind these words took place in Georgia in 1971. Bravery lacking in the majority of politicians. Carter wasn't finished though. He had his sights set on a greater prize, and what came next would startle everyone. Establishment of politics. On December 12, 1974, a little-known governor from Georgia entered the National Press Room, Washington, D.C., club and made a declaration that has experienced political reporters giggling at Jimmy Carter's pursuing a presidential campaign. The response was swift and vicious. Jimmy, who became into here, was a one-term joke that kept coming up. Governor of a state where the majority of Americans unable to find on a map, believing he might win the presidency. The Democratic field contained senators and well-known names, political heavyweights who serve on the cabinet. What was a peanut farmer's chance? But this is what the establishment failed to notice. The year 1976 was ideal for being an outsider. Watergate had ruined Americans' trust in Washington. Vietnam's politics had ended in catastrophe. The economy was having trouble. People were affected by the oil crisis and inflation. Sick of seeing the same old people at the same old assurances. They desired a person distinct, somebody who cleans, someone who refused to tell them that Jimmy Carter was just what America required, even though they unaware of Carter's campaign at the time. The strategy's simplicity was amazing. Meet people anywhere and share the truth. Whereas other contenders concentrated on large media markets and cities during his campaign, Carter visited rural communities and rural areas where other politicians disregarded. He ate and slept in supporters' homes, in neighborhood eateries, and paid attention when people conversed. His message was straightforward but strong. "I'll never tell lies." In the years following Watergate, that wasn't merely a campaign catchphrase, it was a revolutionary promise. The pivotal moment. Carter entered the Iowa caucuses. Everyone was stunned by an unknown outsider who completing first. And then Jimmy, who turned into Jimmy Carter, the potential become president. By March 1976, Carter was not just in charge of the Democratic field, he was in front of Republican President Gerald Ford in the polls. The farmer who grows peanuts from Plains, Georgia, was going to execute the America's biggest political upset. History. On November 2, 1976, Jimmy Carter received 297 votes to win the president. He won the South in the electoral vote, captured important swing states, and demonstrated that everyone in America could becoming president. But gaining the easy part was the election. Now comes the actual difficulty of running a country, and Carter walked to his inauguration during the turmoil. Rather than taking a limousine, a symbolic action that expressed this, his presidency would be different. He sold the presidential, placed solar panels on the yacht, and he had fireside conversations on the White House roof, wearing sweaters with cardigans, and inquired Americans should lower their thermostat settings in order to conserve energy. Washington. He was despised by the establishment for it. Washington didn't matter to Carter, believed he was concerned about doing the right thing, and he was going to confront obstacles that would put every ounce to the test of his moral fortitude. President broke less men than. However, Jimmy Carter wasn't less men. In January 1977, when he assumed office, the United States was dealing with a perfect storm of crisis. Inflation was rapidly increasing. Control cars were lined up due to energy constraints at gas stations. Up for blocks. The Soviet Union was extending its power throughout the world, and Americans were losing trust in their own government. The majority of the presidents would have prioritized the Carter did not tackle him. Easy wins came first. The most difficult issues head on, even when it take the energy and harm him politically. But lawmakers said they would act quickly. Carter gave Americans the hard fixes. The truth is that we were dependent on imported oil. Additionally, kicking that addiction would demand sacrifice, which he referred to as the moral comparable to war, and requested that Americans reduce your driving, consume less electricity, and to cut costs, accept higher prices. Reliance on imports. Was it well liked? Was it totally correct? But Carter's the greatest victory occurred in an unexpected. Egypt has been in the Middle East for 30 years, and Israel had been fierce rivals for 3 conflicts, thousands of deaths, and apparent hatred. Presidents were previously unbeatable. Carter attempted, but was unable, to bring tranquility to the area. But Carter had things they weren't: morally patient with power and a complete reluctance to give up. In September 1978, Carter invited Anwar, the president of Egypt, Israeli Prime Minister Menem Sadat, start the peace negotiations in Camp David. What diplomatic magic was what followed. For 13 days, Carter wouldn't allow either. When negotiations deadlocked, the leader left, strolled around the building's grounds with them. Interpersonal relationships. At the time of their disagreement, when they wanted to stop, he acted as a mediator, persuaded them to remain. He even discovered Bean's grandchildren's names to customize the discussions on September 17, 1978. Following almost 2 weeks of difficult talks, Sadat and Egypt's Camp David Accords were signed by Bean, became the first country in the Arab world to formally acknowledge Israel's entitlement to exist. Israel consented to give the Sinai back, Egypt's peninsula, and Carter had accomplished a goal that has eluded every former president. Middle East peace. Carter was celebrated by everyone on the planet, had demonstrated that diplomatic patience might achieve what was impossible with battle, but the crises that would define his presidency and finally put a stop to it on Iranian November 4, 1979, the American embassy was overrun by insurgents. 52 Americans are being held captive in Thran. They called for the ousted to return. Shah, who was undergoing medical care. The situation in the United States would endure 444 days and control Carter's night after night in the office for the last year. Walter Cronkite was counted by Americans. Day 100 of the hostage situation. On days 200 and 300, Carter made every effort. Economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure, covert talks, but nothing was successful. Carter was getting older due to pressure. He could feel it clearly in the White House. Personally accountable for each and every, he assured their families that he wouldn't stop till they reached their house, and he meant it. The unsuccessful rescue attempt in the breaking point was April 1980. American soldiers lost their lives in the Iranian desert when aircraft ran into each other while the mission was canceled due to a sandstorm. The captives were still held, and Carter's that night, the presidency was essentially over. In November 1980, Ronald Reagan emerged victorious. Carter won the election by a landslide, the first president to be elected since the loss of Herbert Hoover's re-election was an embarrassing loss for a man who had seemed unstoppable at one point, but now regarding Jimmy Carter, he was simply beginning because of what he did following their departure from the White House would make his administration appears to be a warm-up act. Jimmy Carter was 56 years old when he was former president officially. Most men would write memoirs in his role and provide speeches for hefty fees and take pleasure in a Jimmy Carter in a peaceful retirement constructed homes for the underprivileged. Consider that briefly, a previous president of taking up a hammer in the us and nails while assisting volunteers to provide houses for families unable to. Carter, don't buy them for publicity. Sincerely thought that everyone deserved a good place to live, but that was only the start. In 1982, Carter and the Carter Center was established by Rosalind in Atlanta. Their goal was straightforward, yet eager to fight for peace and combat illness and foster optimism globally. While speaking, other former presidents gathered. Carter was keeping an eye on elections and ensuring democracy in emerging countries possessed a chance. The Carter Center dispatched observers to more than 100 elections globally, ranging from Nicaragua to Nepal. Carter himself traveled from Ghana to Guyana, oversaw a large number of these travel missions to risky nations where other nations' leaders wouldn't risk it because he wasn't simply noticing that he was averting conflicts by guaranteeing free and impartial elections. Carter's health work came next. Choose to address illnesses that the others' guinea worm had been forgotten. Illness, for instance, had infected millions of individuals throughout Africa, and there is a parasite in Asia that actually comes out of people's skin after developing. For a year, the agony inside their bodies is agonizing. The impairment is terrible. At the beginning of Carter's guinea worm project, there were 3.5 million cases in 1986. Globally, there were only 14 by 2024. Carter did more than merely raise money. In cases 14, he traveled to the remote for this reason. Villages in Ethiopia, Chad, and Sudan instructing individuals on infection prevention. One of the previous US presidents demonstrating locals while kneeling on the soil how to purify their water, but maybe the most prominent post-presidential was employed by Habitat for Humanity every day, year for more over 30 years, Jimmy, and for a week. Rosalind Carter constructed houses that aren't truly overseeing construction, installing drywall while pounding nails, painting walls till they were in their 90s. Carters continued to arrive with difficult labor gloves and hats. The pictures were powerful. 39th President of the United States sweating with rolled-up sleeves, volunteers constructing homes for individuals. It redefined what an individual he had never met. Carter, the former president, may have written more than 30 volumes, including works and memoirs on Middle East policies and religious poetry. In his hometown, he was a Sunday school teacher. Plains, Georgia, church long into his 90s. These classes were open to everyone. Agents from the Secret Service would stand in the return as a prior president talked about Bible texts with both tourists and farmers. In 2002, the Nobel Committee granted Carter's decades-long Peace Prize, a relentless search for tranquil remedies for global disputes to promote human rights, democracy, and to advance social and economic development. The Nobel Prize in Norway in particular. The committee observed that the award went to Carter directly instead of compared to the Carter Center, acknowledging his own contributions to the globe. Carter's peace was just the third American the Nobel Peace Prize winner for presidency. Joining Woodrow and Theodore Roosevelt. Wilson's polls by his 90s revealed that Carter was now among the most America's most admired men. The president who was turned down by voters in 1980, now seen as a leader of moral character and humanitarian champion. But Carter's most notable. The exam was still pending for Rosalind and Jimmy. Carter's romance is 8 decades long. She was only 3 days old when they first met. Jimmy's mother was friends with hers mother. They became romantically involved while Rosalind was married at the age of 17 and 77 of marriage, the longest president American marital history. But in 2015, that romantic tale encountered its biggest challenge. Carter, who was 90 years old at the time, was identified as having advanced melanoma. His brain and liver had been affected by cancer. He was given weeks or months by doctors to. During a live press conference, Carter composedly declared his diagnosis, stating that he was comfortable with whatever came next. "I've had a great life," he said, "thousands of pals, and I've experienced an thrilling, daring, and satisfying existence." The world was ready to bid farewell to. However, Jimmy Carter wasn't finished battling. He had radiation therapy and surgery, as well as a trial immunotherapy treatment. The cancer miraculously disappeared. Carter succeeded in beating despite the odds. He continued to construct homes, and he continued to teach Sunday school, continued to promote world peace. He became the longest living person in 2019 president in American history, surpassing the record of George W. Bush. Next came the falls. Carter fell at home in 2019 and shattered his hip and fell when he was getting well once more and required 14 stitches in his. In spite of the wound and a black eye, he continued to go to Nashville to attend a Habitat for Humanity event and say, "I fell and struck my forehead with a sharp edge and needed to see the hospital," he said. Told the audience in a distinctive way, "Funny, however, I had a top priority, and that involved traveling to Nashville and construct homes." On October 1, 2024, Jimmy Carter accomplished something that the president turned 100 years old. Fighter jets that were years old passed over his hometown in Plains, Georgia, in festivities. The man who wasn't expected to endure 1980 had reached his centennial birthday. However, the moment was catching up with the longest living Americans. On February 18, 2023, the Carter Center declared that Jimmy Carter was going to start hospice treatment at his Plains home. The 98-year-old, the outgoing president, had made the decision to halt medical procedures and invest his remaining time with his family at home. The world anticipated that Carter will pass away within. Hospice care usually lasts a few days or weeks, indicates a 6-month life expectancy, or the majority of patients pass away within weeks. After Jimmy Carter disobeyed orders to enter hospice, the odds as well. For almost 2 years, Carter stayed in hospice care with family members nearby, family enjoying baseball games, while still his legacy was shaped by his advocacy work for hospice care in general, demonstrating the potential universe of end-of-life care. Calm and dignified. In November 2023, additionally, Rosalind Carter went into hospice care. She passed away at the age of 96 2 days later, concluding their remarkable 77-year marriage. In spite of his weakened state at her funeral, Jimmy Carter said farewell to the lady he referred to as my equal collaborator in everything that I ever completed. At 10:10 a.m. on December 29, 2024, Jimmy Carter passed away quietly at home, and he lived in Plains, Georgia, and was 89 years old. The president with the longest lifespan. And however, this is what makes American history. Carter's story is even more amazing. His grandson's last act of rebellion disclosed that Carter had informed his relatives his goal was to live long enough to cast a ballot for the 2024 election of Kamala Harris, and he completed the Carter cast on October 15, 2024. His ballot, his last vote following a lifetime of dedication to democracy. The funeral service was scheduled for January 9, 2025, President's Day of National Sorrow. First women, world leaders, and all of you would be present to pay tribute to the peanut a farmer who transformed the world for everyone aside from Michelle Obama, and that's the location our tale completes the cycle. January 9, 2025, at the National, the cathedral was crowded with America's most powerful individuals, President. In the front row are Biden and Dr. Jill Biden, Kamala Harris, the Vice President, and second beside them, gentlemen Doug Moff, Melania Trump, and Donald Trump. The President-elect Trump is a sight to behold, but they're Bill Clinton, the former president, and George W. Bush and their spouses Laura Bush and Hillary Clinton, followed by Barack Obama, is seated by himself. Cameras caught Obama staring at, solemn, yet distinctly alone. The other past presidents sat back. Social media exploded next to his spouse. With inquiries, newscasters rushed for justifications. Even worldwide, the media became aware of the mystery surrounding the Michelle Obama was the first lady who was absent. Was she conveying a political message? There was conflict with the Carter family. There was a scandal that the media was hiding. There was a lot of speculation because the absence of Michelle Obama was actually unparalleled. She had attended all of the main state occasions both during and following her tenure, as she was the first lady to speak at Jimmy Carter's in only a few months, a 100th birthday celebration. Previously, she and Barack had published a joint declaration referring to Carter as an amazing man after his passing. So where was she? Jeff Zelane, a CNN correspondent. Michelle Obama was the first to break the story. Owing to a schedule conflict in Hawaii, according to reports, she was still having a prolonged island vacation. The Obama's beautiful home on the island of Oahu. They bought a property for $8.2 million in 2015. However, that explanation seemed lacking. A presidential funeral is something you don't miss. Do you visit the Carter Center for a vacation? Crystal Carson, the spokesman, released this assertion was made by the former First Lady. Michelle Obama does not show up for the national funeral. For President Carter, Mrs. Obama's service sends her thoughts and blessings for the Carter family and everyone who appreciated and gained knowledge from the that was it. The extraordinary former president, no apology or thorough explanation for the absence of only a brief declaration that posed more queries than it resolved. Here is what we are certain of. The Obamas had always felt a strong bond with Barack. Was born in Hawaii, and they've owned real estate on Oahu since 2015. Every facility is included in this 3-acre estate. As one might anticipate from a presidential retreat, the family, solitude, elegance, and ocean views has frequently taken long vacations there, particularly in the winter. However, this is what makes this circumstance unique. Michelle Obama had been more nuanced, addressing the sources that are near the family characterized as worn out and a requirement for prolonged relaxation. The previous few years had been very difficult. She had been the former First Lady, showcasing her most recent creations, making regular appearances, and keeping up her function as one of the greatest powerful women. According to friends, she had been excited for this trip to Hawaii and had specifically planned it for months. As a total departure from the public commitments, although the timing was bad, it wasn't malevolent. According to reliable sources, Michelle Obama's preparations, the Hawaii trip was long planned. Prior to Carter's December 29th death, when the notice of the funeral was made for the Obama family was confronted with a challenging decision: shortcut Michelle's necessary rest or have Barack come. They decided on the latter. Barack Obama's visit by himself resulted in one of the most discussed events of the funeral, his long animated dialogue with Donald Trump. The two men sitting next to each other were spotted camera giggling and conversing as usual despite their political differences. Friends' distinctions. Observers pointed out that Barack appeared to more laid back and lively than he would have been had Michelle been present to control the appearance. But the truth isn't about calculating politics or secret dramas. It's about a lot of even former First Ladies need to be more human. Michelle Obama took 8 years off. As one of the ladies who was most closely examined in every outfit in America, examined every phrase that is understood by every public appearance, became a declaration regarding politics, gender, or race since departing the White House that she had been carrying that weight while creating her own profession while preserving her family's privacy. The trip to Hawaii symbolized a valuable moment apart from everything. It's time to be Michelle alone. Former First Lady Michelle Obama's time to relax without schedules, cameras, or expectations of the public. When given the option to choose between reducing that amount of time or skipping a public gathering, especially one as important as she, picked her own funeral for Jimmy Carter. And that decision conveys a significant message regarding how public figures, in particular women, are becoming more adept at establishing limits. The absence that made people talk wasn't concerning disdain or controversy. It was about a female individual who had provided decades of public service, determining that occasionally Michelle Obama prioritizes her own well-being. Absence from the funeral of Jimmy Carter turned into a tale, since we anticipate public figures to make sacrifices, particularly women, everything for show. However, perhaps the true tale is that Michelle Obama demonstrated something to us distinct, that it's okay to select oneself even in front of others. Carter, Jimmy, who spent his post-program redefining what it meant to be president, have served as president in the past, enjoyed that lesson. Occasionally, the most drastic action you can do is just look after yourself. Music.